Everyone in that ballroom saw him kiss her. Nobody in that ballroom knew whose ballroom it was. 200 guests in black tie, 3 chandeliers throwing gold light across the marble, and in the middle of it, a man named Julian Ashford pulled a woman who was not his wife into his arms and kissed her like the room belonged to him. It didn't. It never had. And the woman standing 30 feet away, in a plain navy dress with no name tag and no seat at the head table, was about to prove it. If you've ever built something with your own 2 hands while the person beside you took the credit, stay with this one. Because tonight, the quiet woman in the corner is not who anyone in that room thinks she is. Watch closely. This story has a very short fuse and a very long memory. Her name was Wren Calloway, and for 11 years she had been Mrs. Julian Ashford. Nobody at that gala called her that. Half of them didn't know her face at all, and that was exactly how she'd planned it. Let me back up, because to understand why a woman would stand in the back of her own building and watch her husband humiliate her in front of 200 strangers, you have to understand where Wren Calloway came from and what she was taught to do with pain a long time before Julian Ashford ever said her name. Wren grew up 2 floors above a dry cleaning shop in a part of the city that developers hadn't discovered yet. Her mother, Idris Calloway, ran the shop's back room, a narrow space that smelled of steam and starch, where she altered wedding dresses for women who could barely afford them and never charged what the work was worth. Idris had one real skill in this world, and it was thread. She could take a torn hem, a ruined seam, a dress that looked finished for the trash, and make it disappear into something whole again. People used to say you couldn't even find where she'd fixed it. Wren spent her childhood sitting on an overturned crate in that back room, watching her mother's hands move faster than her eyes could follow. She learned to thread a needle before she learned to write in cursive. And every night, before Wren went up the back stairs to bed, Idris would press a small silver thimble into her palm, worn smooth, dented on one side, older than either of them, and say the same 6 words. The stitch you don't see holds longest. It became the closest thing the Calloway family had to scripture. The stitches that show off, Idris used to say, the big decorative ones, they're for people who want to be noticed. The stitch that holds the whole garment together, the one buried on the inside where nobody will ever look, that's the one doing the actual work. Loud thread breaks. Quiet thread lasts. Idris had one dream bigger than the shop, and she never hid it from her daughter. She wanted, someday, to build something grand. Not just mend other people's finest moments, but host them. A hall. A place where the biggest nights of people's lives happened, weddings, galas, milestone birthdays, and where the woman who understood fine fabric and finer details ran the whole operation from behind the curtain, unseen and untouchable. She never got the chance. A property developer named Preston Vale, a man with a good haircut and no patience for a seamstress's ambition, bought the building 2 doors down that Idris had spent 4 years trying to save enough to lease. He turned it into a boutique event space inside 18 months, put his name on a brass plaque out front, and told a local paper that some people dream and some people build. He was talking about himself. He didn't know he was talking about the 11-year-old girl folding napkins in the back room 2 doors down, listening. Idris never got her haul. She got a heart condition instead, and she died the year Wren turned 19, in a hospital bed with a thimble tucked into her hand because Wren refused to let the nurses take it off her. Hold on to that thimble. We're not finished with it. Not even close. 2 years after her mother died, broke, grieving, and working 3 jobs to finish a business degree at night, Wren met Julian Ashford at a diner where she waited tables on weekends. He was 26, handsome in the effortless way that made older women tip him compliments instead of cash, and completely, spectacularly broke. He had a business plan for a boutique real estate firm and exactly $4,000 to his name. He talked about that plan the way Wren's mother used to talk about the hall, eyes lit up, hands moving, like the future was already real and just waiting for permission. Wren fell for him the way people fall for the version of someone who hasn't disappointed them yet. When his first deal nearly collapsed 2 years into their marriage, a permit dispute that threatened to bankrupt him before he'd built anything, Wren did the one thing her mother had taught her better than anyone. She fixed it from the inside, quietly, without asking for credit. She sold the only thing of real value she owned, a small parcel of land her mother had somehow, impossibly, managed to hold onto until her death, the last surviving piece of the old neighborhood. Wren never told Julian what it cost her to sign that sale. She just handed him the money and watched the color come back into his face, and told herself that was what love looked like. Love holds the seam nobody sees. He thanked her. That first year, he thanked her constantly. By year 6, he'd stopped. Here's the part that matters, the part you need to sit with before we go any further. Julian Ashford did not become cruel overnight. Nobody does. It happened one polite dismissal at a time. Wren kept handling everything. The accounting Julian was too impatient for, the difficult clients, the late nights untangling contracts he'd half-read, and instead of gratitude, something curdled in him. A man who is constantly rescued starts to resent his rescuer. It's an ugly, human thing, but it's true, and Julian was not immune to it. He started introducing her at dinners as my wife, she keeps the books, in a tone that made it sound smaller than it was. He started taking the meetings without her. He started staying late at the office for reasons that had less and less to do with the office. That's where Sable Reyes comes in. Sable was 29, sharp, hungry in the particular way people get when they've spent their whole life one paycheck from disaster and have decided, quietly and permanently, that it will never happen to them again. She worked in marketing for a boutique events firm that Julian's company frequently hired, and she was everything Wren had learned not to be in public. Loud in meetings, magnetic in a room, allergic to being overlooked. When Sable laughed at Julian's jokes, she laughed like he was the funniest man alive. When Wren used to laugh at them, she'd laughed quietly, the way you laugh at something you already know the ending to. Julian mistook noise for admiration. He always had. I want you to hold a little sympathy for Sable here, even knowing what's coming, because this story isn't interested in easy villains. She wasn't chasing Julian's money out of malice. She was chasing the version of safety she'd never had, and Julian, dressed up in expensive suits and bigger promises than he could cash, looked exactly like a door out. She had no idea whose husband she was standing next to. She had absolutely no idea what building she was about to be kissed inside of. By the time we get to the night of the gala, Julian had been seeing Sable for 8 months, and he'd convinced himself of a story that made it feel almost noble. Wren doesn't need me anymore, he told himself. She's fine. She's quiet. She'll understand, eventually, or she won't, and either way, he'd already decided the marriage was a formality he was outgrowing. What Julian did not know, what nobody at Ashford Realty knew, what Sable certainly didn't know, what even Julian's own mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Corinne who'd never warmed to Wren, did not know, was where Wren had been for the past 7 years on the nights she claimed to be consulting. 7 years earlier, quietly, using her maiden name and a business structure designed specifically so no search engine would ever connect the two, Wren Calloway had begun buying failing event venues. One at a time. A ballroom in receivership here. A boutique hotel with a foreclosure notice there. She used the last of her mother's savings, then a small loan, then the profits from the first flip, then the next. She hired people who had been overlooked the way her mother had been overlooked, a chef pushed out of a restaurant that folded, an event director laid off in a merger, a general manager fired for being too particular about details that turned out to matter enormously. She built the way her mother had sown. Quietly. On the inside. Where nobody thought to look. She named the company Calloway Hall Group. Not Ashford. Calloway. Her mother's name, on every deed, every contract, every brass plaque, in the exact grand lettering Preston Vale had once used to erase a 19-year-old girl's future. 7 years, and Julian never asked a single question about where his wife disappeared to 2 nights a week. That should tell you something about how well she'd learned to hold a seam nobody could see. By the year of that gala, Calloway Hall Group owned 11 venues across the region. The largest of them, a converted historic exchange building with 3 ballrooms, 40-foot ceilings, and a reputation as the most requested address in the city for exactly this kind of black-tie charity gala, was called the Wren. Sit with that for a second. She named the crown jewel of her secret empire after herself. Not because she needed the ego of it. Because her mother had never gotten to put her own name on anything, and Wren had promised her, standing in that hospital room with a thimble in her fist, that somebody in this family finally would. Julian's company was one of the sponsors of that night's gala, a charity fundraiser for children's literacy, black tie, $300 a plate, The kind of event where developers buy tables to be photographed near people more important than them. Julian had bought a table for 8. He'd told Wren, almost as an afterthought, that she didn't need to come. It's mostly work people, you'd be bored, and Wren had smiled and said that sounded fine. She didn't need an invitation. She owned the building. She arrived 2 hours early, the way she always did, walked the service corridors in low heels and a plain navy dress that made her invisible to exactly the kind of people who mattered in that room, checked in with her event director about the seating charts and the lighting cues, and then, as the guests began arriving, she did what she'd done at every gala for 7 years. She stood near the back, unnoticed, and watched her building do exactly what she'd built it to do. She saw Julian arrive at 8:15, laughing too loud at his own joke, his hand resting on the small of a young woman's back in a way that told Wren everything before her mind had even finished processing the woman's face. She recognized Sable from a company holiday party photo she'd once scrolled past without much thought. She watched them move through the room like they owned it, Julian introducing Sable to men from his firm as a friend, his eyes daring anyone to ask a follow-up question. Nobody did. Nobody at Ashford Realty was going to embarrass the boss's night. Wren didn't move. Didn't confront him at the door. Didn't do a single thing that would have given the moment away. She simply stood near the service hallway, 30 feet from her own husband, and watched, the way she'd learned to watch everything important in her life. Quietly, from a distance, gathering exactly what she needed before she did anything at all. Here's the question I want you sitting with, because it's the one that decides everything that happens next. Why didn't she stop it right there? She could have. One word to her event director, one signal, and security would have been at Julian's elbow in under a minute. She didn't. And the reason she didn't tells you more about Wren Calloway than anything that's about to happen on that ballroom floor. She wanted to see how far he'd go when he thought absolutely nobody was watching who mattered. She didn't have to wait long. At 9:40, during the cocktail hour lull right before dinner service, with a string quartet between sets and half the room's attention drifting toward the open bar, Julian pulled Sable behind one of the tall marble columns near the west wall. The exact column, though he had no way of knowing this, positioned directly beneath a small brass plaque engraved with the words in memory of Idris Calloway, who taught this house to hold its seams. Wren had installed that plaque herself, in a spot most guests never noticed, the way her mother had taught her to put the important work where it wouldn't show off. And there, under her mother's name, in the building her mother had died still dreaming about, Julian Ashford kissed Sable Reyes in front of a scattering of guests who absolutely noticed. Phones absolutely came up, and one very sharp-eyed gossip columnist from the city paper, seated at the next table specifically to cover which developers showed up with which dates, got the whole thing in 4 crisp photographs. Wren watched from 30 feet away. Her face didn't move. Her hands, folded in front of her, didn't shake. But her thumb found the inside of her palm, where a small silver thimble, she still carried it everywhere, in a coat pocket, in a clutch, never far from her skin, pressed hard enough to leave a mark. The stitch you don't see holds longest. She turned and walked back through the service door, into the hallway lined with framed photographs of every event the Wren had ever hosted, and she let herself feel it. Just for 90 seconds, alone, in a hallway her own money had built, she let 11 years of quiet accumulate into something that finally had somewhere to go. She didn't cry loudly. She never did anything loudly. She pressed one hand flat against the cool marble wall and breathed until the shaking stopped, and then she wiped her eyes, straightened the collar of a dress nobody at that party had bothered to look twice at, and made a single phone call to her event director. "Bring the lights up in the main ballroom in 10 minutes, she said. "And have Desmond ready with the microphone." Desmond Okafor had been the Wren's general manager for 6 years, ever since Wren pulled him out of the ashes of a hotel merger that treated 20-year staffers like furniture. He was the only person in that building, besides Wren herself, who knew exactly whose name sat behind the deed. He'd been waiting 7 years for a night like this one, and he did not waste a single second of it. At 10 o'clock, with the room fully seated for dinner and Julian Ashford settled at his table with Sable's hand resting a little too comfortably near his on the white tablecloth, the lights over the head table dimmed and a single spotlight found the small stage where the evening's remarks were meant to begin. Desmond stepped up to the microphone, and every head in the ballroom turned. "Before we begin tonight's program," he said, his voice warm, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who has been given the honor of saying something true. I'd like to do something we don't usually do at these events. I'd like to introduce the woman whose building you're all standing in tonight. A ripple of polite curiosity moved through the crowd. Julian barely glanced up from his plate. 7 years ago, Desmond continued. This building was 3 months from foreclosure, and I was 3 weeks from unemployment. One woman bought it, rebuilt it from the studs, and turned it into the venue you're all sitting inside right now, without ever once putting her face on a press release. She named it after her mother, a seamstress who never lived to see it finished. Tonight, for the first time, she's agreed to let me say her name out loud in this room. Wren stepped out from the service hallway, still in that plain navy dress, and walked toward the stage. Watch the room. Watch it happen in slow motion the way it actually did. It started with the staff. Every server, every bartender, every member of the event team who had spent years working under Wren's quiet direction stopped where they stood and turned toward her. The way you turn toward someone who has earned the whole room's attention without ever asking for it. Then the front tables noticed the staff had stopped, and turned to see what they were looking at. Then table by table, the ripple spread backward through the ballroom, chair legs scraping against marble as 200 guests twisted around to see the woman walking calmly toward the stage in a dress that suddenly looked less like an afterthought and more like a woman who never needed the noise in the first place. And then it reached Julian's table. I wish you could have seen his face in real time, the exact moment the pieces assembled themselves behind his eyes. His wife, walking toward a stage. In his building. His building that had never, not once in 11 years, actually been his. Calloway, Desmond said into the microphone. Once Wren had reached the stage and taken it gently from his hand. Some of you might recognize the name from the deed. Ladies and gentlemen, the founder and owner of Calloway Hall Group, Wren Calloway. Julian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Sable's hand, still resting near his on the white tablecloth, went very still. Here's what I need you to understand about the 2 questions this story has been quietly building toward, because they both landed at exactly the same second. Question 1. Whose name was actually on the building Julian had spent the whole night performing ownership of, the building he'd bragged about sponsoring, the building where he'd just publicly humiliated a woman he thought had no power at all. And question 2, the one that mattered even more, how long had Wren known, and how much of Julian's life, the loans his firm carried through a lender partly financed by Calloway Holdings, the venue contracts his company depended on, the very gala he'd used to stage his affair, had quietly been resting inside her hands the entire time, without him ever once thinking to ask. She took the microphone gently, and the room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when it senses it is about to witness something it will talk about for years. Thank you, Desmond, she said, her voice steady, unhurried, carrying easily to the back of the room without ever needing to rise. I don't usually do this. I like this building to speak for itself. But tonight I think it's earned a proper introduction, and so, it turns out, have I. A few nervous laughs. Nobody quite understood yet, except the one table that mattered. My mother spent her whole life altering other people's biggest moments, Wren continued. Weddings. Anniversaries. She never got to host one of her own. She used to tell me that the stitch nobody sees is the one holding the whole thing together. I've thought about that a lot tonight, actually. About how much can be holding a room up that nobody in it ever bothered to look for. Every phone in the room was up now, not for Julian anymore, but for her. This building is named for her. Every venue Calloway Hall owns is run on the same principle she taught me in a dry cleaning shop most of you have never heard of. Do the work quietly. Let it hold. Let the people who mistake quiet for weak find that out on their own time. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Enjoy your dinner, she said, and stepped off the stage. She did not look at Julian's table on her way down. She didn't need to. The whole room was already looking at it for her. What happened at that table over the next 4 minutes has been described to me by 3 separate guests who were seated close enough to hear it, and every version agrees on the essential shape of it, even if the exact words shift slightly in the retelling. Julian stood up so fast his chair nearly went over. Corinne, his mother, sitting 2 seats down in a dress that cost more than Wren's entire outfit, went the color of the tablecloth. And Sable, hungry, sharp, desperate never to be poor again. Sable looked from Julian to the departing figure of the woman who apparently owned the ground they were all standing on, and did the math faster than anyone else at that table. "You told me your wife did the books," she said, low, furious, already reaching for her clutch. "You told me she was nobody." Sable, wait, I didn't know she. You didn't know your own wife owns this building? Or you knew and you thought I wouldn't find out? She didn't wait for an answer. She stood, smoothed her dress with hands that were shaking now for an entirely different reason than the ones that had shaken with excitement 2 hours earlier, and walked out through the same ballroom doors she'd walked in through on Julian's arm, except this time completely alone, past a room full of people who had just watched exactly how small the future he'd promised her actually was. Julian went after Wren instead. Of course he did. Men like Julian always chase the thing that just proved it never needed them. He caught up to her in the service hallway, the one lined with photographs of a decade's worth of other people's important nights, and he said her name the way you say a word you're realizing you never fully understood. "Wren. Wren, wait. Please. We need to talk about this." She stopped. Turned. And here is the part of this story I want you to remember longer than any of the rest of it, because it's the part that separates a woman who's been humiliated from a woman who has already, quietly, made peace with everything that's coming. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She looked, if anything, tired in the specific way you look after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying much too far. 7 years, Julian, she said. 7 years I built this, and you never once asked where I went 2 nights a week. Not because you trusted me. Because you'd stopped being curious about me at all. That's not. I sold my mother's land to save your first deal, she said, cutting through him without raising her voice even a little. I never told you what that cost me, because I thought that's what marriage was. Holding the seam nobody sees. I kept doing it for 11 years while you slowly decided I was something you'd outgrown. He opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out of it. I'm not angry that you fell for someone else, she said, and she meant it, which somehow made it worse for him to hear. People fall out of love. That happens. I'm angry that you thought you could humiliate me in a room, in a building, that you never once bothered to actually understand. You didn't even know whose ground you were standing on, Julian. That's not a marriage problem. That's a you problem. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single card, the direct line of her family law attorney, a woman named Priscilla Kemelu who had, unbeknownst to Julian, already been retained for exactly this contingency 4 months earlier, the week Wren first found a hotel receipt she wasn't supposed to see. Call her tomorrow, Wren said, pressing the card into his hand. I'm not interested in cruelty. I built too much in the last 7 years to spend the next 7 being petty about the man who almost talked me out of it. But I am done holding this particular seam. She walked away, down the hallway lined with photographs, and left him standing there in the building he no longer had any claim to at all, with a business card in his hand and a fiancé-shaped hole where his evening had been 20 minutes earlier. The fallout, once it started, moved fast, the way these things always do once the truth finally has somewhere to travel. The gossip columnist's photographs ran 2 days later, not with Julian's name attached to the affair, that came later, in the divorce filings, but with a much bigger story underneath it, about the reclusive founder of Calloway Hall Group finally stepping into public view at her own flagship gala. Reporters who'd spent years failing to identify who actually owned the most requested event spaces in the city suddenly had their answer, and it came with a photograph of a woman in a plain navy dress standing calmly at a microphone while, several feet away and slightly out of frame, her husband's face did all the talking his mouth couldn't manage. Ashford Realty lost 2 major contracts within a month, both of them venues Calloway Hall either owned outright or had significant lending influence over. Nobody forced Wren's hand on that. She didn't have to make a single call. Business partners simply stopped wanting to be associated with a man whose own wife had just publicly, quietly, devastatingly outclassed him in his own industry. Julian would spend the better part of 2 years rebuilding a reputation that had never actually been his own to begin with. It had always been borrowed, the way the ballroom that night had been borrowed, the way the whole marriage had quietly run on infrastructure he'd never once thought to ask who was holding up. Corinne, Julian's mother, the woman who had spent a decade calling Wren sweet, but a little plain at every family dinner, sent one email in the weeks after, asking whether the family might still be invited to host events at Calloway venues going forward, for old times' sake. Wren's assistant handled it the way Wren's assistant handled all correspondence. She didn't feel required a personal reply. Sable, for what it's worth, landed on her feet, more or less. She left the events industry entirely within the year, took a marketing job in a different city with a company that had no connection to Julian, Wren, or anyone in that ballroom, and by every account has stayed as far from black tie galas as her career allows. I told you not to hate her too easily. Desperation makes people reach for the wrong ladder. It doesn't make them irredeemable. It just makes them human, the same as the rest of us. And Wren did the thing she'd always done best. She went back to work. 2 years after that gala, Calloway Hall Group had grown to 19 venues. The Wren remained the flagship, and every year, on the anniversary of her mother's death, Wren closes the building to the public for one private evening and hosts a dinner for the staff. Servers, cooks, the people whose names never make it onto brass plaques anywhere. She tells them, every year, some version of the same thing her mother told her on an overturned crate in the back of a dry cleaning shop that doesn't exist anymore. Last spring, she hired a 19-year-old event coordinator named Talia, a sharp, quiet young woman who'd grown up doing alterations in her aunt's tailoring shop to help pay for business school, and who had a habit of hanging back near the edges of every event instead of standing in the center of the room. Wren noticed her the way she noticed everyone who reminded her of a version of herself she hadn't quite left behind. At the end of Talia's first big event, after the last guests had gone and the staff was breaking down the tables, Wren found her in the service hallway, straightening a stack of chairs nobody had asked her to straighten. "You did good work tonight," Wren told her. "Nobody noticed it, which means you did it right." Talia looked confused. The way people always do the first time someone tells them invisibility can be a compliment. Wren reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around something small, worn smooth, dented on one side, older than either of them. "Here," she said, pressing the thimble into Talia's palm. "This kept a whole family alive once. It's held a wedding dress, a bankruptcy, an entire company nobody thought a poor seamstress's daughter could build. I think it's got a little more work left in it." "What do I do with it?" "Nothing, yet," Wren said. "Just keep it close. And remember something, for whenever the day comes that somebody underestimates you in a room they think they own." She smiled, the same quiet, unhurried smile she'd worn on a stage 2 years earlier while a room full of strangers finally learned her name. "The stitch you don't see holds longest. So here's what I want you to carry out of this one, because it's bigger than Wren, bigger than Julian, bigger than any single ballroom. The people who mistake your quiet for your ceiling are almost always standing on a floor they never bothered to check the ownership of. Being underestimated isn't a wound. Sometimes, if you let it, it's the best cover you'll ever have. If Wren's story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Like this video for every quiet person who's ever been counted out of a room they were actually holding up. Comment "the stitch holds" if you believe patience always outlasts noise. And subscribe, because the next person somebody underestimates in one of these stories, it might just be you.